So for this demonstration, I'm going to go through color theory and we're going to do a mixing demo. So at the moment, I'm setting up my palette. One thing that you should keep in mind with your palette is you should set it up consistently every single time. And I always pretty much have my lightest value pigments. So I'm going from titanium white. I have a cadmium yellow lemon, a cadmium yellow deep, a cad red, a quinacridone red, an ultramarine blue, and a phthalo blue green shade. Now I just put out some lamp black. I'm going to put out some phthalo blue red shade. This is alizarin crimson permanent, phthalo green, cobalt blue, and last but not least, this is cadmium orange. I'm going to put two additional pigments out here. This is Hansa Yellow Deep. It's really runny for some reason. And I'm also going to put out some yellow ochre. But we're mainly going to focus on those 6 initial pigments plus white. And this is our warm and cool primary set plus the titanium white. And that gives us a great range of colors. These other ones that I put out, we will talk about them as we really hone in on discussing neutrals and complements. And we're going to use the Hansa Yellow Deep and the yellow ochre later on in the process. So I'm just taking some of my phthalo blue, and you can see already with that phthalo blue, it is a really potent pigment. And I've mentioned this before, but it's one of the most pervasive pigments that you can purchase. And what I mean by that is it has a really high tinting strength. And at the moment, I'm comparing between the phthalo blue green shade and the phthalo blue red shade. And they have a slight different temperature quality to both of them. And those will come into play. So make sure that for our course, it's preferable that you have phthalo blue green shade, since more or less our ultramarine blue is going to act as having that reddish undertone that's going to be important for us. So we're going to make it green. I'm going to make the most intense green possible. And so I'm going to use the phthalo blue and my cadmium lemon, because these are both leaning naturally towards a green. And so by taking advantage of their inherent properties, we can really maximize and make a really saturated hue. And when I add white to it, it really cools it down. So in order to kind of still have it feel more green as opposed to blue, I'm really having to add in even more yellow into that mixture. So that's a great way to get an extremely saturated yellow. However, if I mix my ultramarine blue and my cad yellow deep, those are both leaning towards a red. Well, red is the complement of green. And so if I try to make it green with those pigments, it's going to be already a little bit neutralized. So you're going to get more of an earthy green when you use the ultramarine blue and the cad yellow deep. And so I'm just mixing a tint for the ultramarine blue, and I'm comparing it right next to the phthalo blue green shade. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another green using the ultramarine blue, and then I'm going to use the cad yellow lemon. And since one is leaning a little bit more towards a red and then the other one is leaning a little bit towards a green, well, they're going to not necessarily work together all that well, but it's going to be a little bit more saturated than the previous green of the ultramarine blue and the cad yellow, but it's not going to be as intense as our first mixture. And so this is why having a warm and cool primary set can be really beneficial, because it gives us a lot of control on how we can make some of our secondary as well as our tertiary colors. So one other thing that I should mention is whenever I lay out my palette, I not only put the colors in the same order, I'm also squeezing out each pigment in a straight line. And there's a few reasons for this, but the main reason is it's going to preserve the purity of your paint a little bit longer, because I'm always just taking from the front end while still allowing the rest of that pile to be more or less untouched. And that's going to allow you to have cleaner mixtures long term. So at the moment, we're making up our orange. The first little mixture that I just did there was using the cad yellow deep as well as the cadmium red. And since both of those kind of lean towards an orange, it's going to make me a very vibrant orange. I also put next to it the actual cadmium orange just as a comparison. And we're making now another orange using quinacridone red as well as our lemon yellow. And since those are not necessarily leaning towards an orange inherently, well, it's going to give us a slightly different result. It's still actually a pretty nice orange. It's not as dramatic as when we made our greens. So at the moment, what I'm doing now is I'm taking the cadmium orange, I'm adding white to it, but when I add the white to it, it kind of cools it down a lot. So you're usually going to have to also add white as well as a little bit of yellow if you want to retain that warmth, that distinct quality. At the moment, we're making our violet. So I used the ultramarine blue as well as the quinacridone. Since those are both leaning towards a reddish violet undertone, well, it's going to give us actually a really saturated violet. This is actually one of my favorite colors to mix. There's just something really nice about it, and you can kind of see it there on the palette. Now we're going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to use the phthalo blue green shade plus the cadmium red, and when I make this mixture together, its result's going to be a little bit different. And this is one of the confusing things about how we understand color theory, is that, well, color theory doesn't always match what our pigments are capable of doing. So I'm adding white to this mixture of the cadmium red plus the phthalo blue green shade, and it is an extremely dull, almost perfect gray. But I want to compare it to, well, if I add white to black and make a gray, how does this mixture from the cadmium red and the phthalo blue kind of look by comparison? So if we add just a little bit more red, we can kind of shift it in the direction that we really want it to be, and maybe have a little bit of those distinct characteristics of either having a little bit more of a reddish violet undertone. Now I'm mixing up another batch of the ultramarine blue and quinacridone, and I'm going to make a really nice gray out of this. This is one of my favorite combinations to make neutrals. Well, the opposite on the color wheel, or the complement of violet, is yellow. So I'm going to add my cadmium yellow to this. And whenever I mix my colors, I always keep it to just 3 pigments plus white. I never deviate from that rule. And the reason is it makes my life a little bit easier in terms of, oh, okay, if I know I need to go in this direction and these are my pigments, well, then I just have to keep adding and changing the ratios in order to shift it in that direction. Due to the way oil paint is, it stays open for a very long time, so you have the freedom to modulate it. And so you can see here, I made a pretty nice gray with those fairly saturated colors. Once again, that was the ultramarine blue, the quinacridone red, and the cadmium yellow deep plus white to create that neutral. Now I'm going to show you a few different options for us to make neutrals and more or less a chromatic black. I'm using phthalo green and I'm using alizarin crimson permanent. So with the alizarin crimson permanent plus the phthalo green, I make probably the richest black that you can actually mix. When you mix it with white, well, it has this kind of violet-y undertone. It's actually a really nice gray. And I'm just trying to get it so that it's kind of in a happy medium of not either being too red or too green. Just kind of wiping off my palette. Now I'm going to try the cobalt blue with the cadmium orange. And we know that on the color wheel, these are complements. They're directly across. But as we've kind of learned, sometimes the complements don't really get us the desired result. So I'm adding white to it because sometimes we have to add white to really kind of see the true characteristics of our mixture, because it might just look more like a brown. And what I'm doing right now is, all right, we've made a really nice gray from all these different options. Let's make something more like a really nice earth tone. So we're going to try to match our yellow ochre. And so I took my cadmium yellow deep and a little bit of my cad red and my ultramarine blue plus white, and I'm trying to essentially get as close as possible to a tint of the yellow ochre. And once again, a tint is either a pigment directly out of the tube or a mixture plus white. And so I'm just trying to compare it. I want to make a little bit more of that yellow ochre so that way it's a little bit easier to see within the camera. And so after I did that, I just needed to add just the tiniest bit of the cadmium yellow and the cadmium red in order to shift it in the direction that it really needed to be. Once again, just a very minute amount can push it in the direction that you want it to be in. So now I'm just going to compare the difference between the Hansa Yellow Deep and essentially our cadmium yellow deep. Because directly out of the tube, they look about the same. But I wanted to see what would happen if I added white to them. Would distinct characteristics be present? And what I could see, and it might admittedly not be entirely apparent in the video, is that there's a little bit more of a reddish undertone in the Hansa Yellow Deep, and it's a lot thinner. Because of cadmium being extremely opaque because it's a heavy metal based pigment, well, that might be a reason for you to go with the cadmium because of how you're going to eventually use it. I put a little bit of linseed oil on my palette, and I wanted to mix it into some of these paints just to see how it would change the viscosity. In addition, it might also reveal some of the unique characteristics of that pigment's undertone. At the very beginning of this video, we saw the two distinctions of the phthalo blue, the red shade and the green shade. When we put it in a thin film, well, there was some unique characteristics that were revealed. Now what I wanted to do, since we made a really nice gray using quinacridone red, as well as the cadmium yellow deep and the ultramarine blue, I wanted to try to make another neutral using the other pigments. So using phthalo blue, cadmium red, and the cadmium lemon yellow. And I knew this was going to give me a very different result, but I thought, well, if I'm trying to essentially neutralize it, get it down to almost a perfect gray, and I knew that this was possible, I just had to kind of figure out what were the right ratios. This is obviously not something that you have to think ahead of time. You just have to kind of go for it and keep pushing the paint along by adding a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Once again, I'm always keeping it to just those three pigments that I've identified plus white. I'm adding more white to it, putting it right next to my other mixture of the quinacridone red, the ultramarine blue, and the cadmium yellow deep. And by adding white, well, I'm getting it to the exact same value, so it's a little bit easier for me to cross compare. And I think it's pretty darn close. I don't think that there's much more for me to do. And right at the moment, you can see I'm just putting out those original colors right next to it so that you can see that. At this point, I'm just making another neutral using lamp black plus white, so that way we can kind of see, well, how do these two neutrals really compare against what is considered a perfect gray. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a yellow. We're going to take our cadmium yellow deep and we're going to try to darken it. And this is one reason why we tried to avoid using black in our palette. Pretty much from this point forward, I don't want us to use black. Because as you can see here, when I darkened that yellow using black, well, it made it a green. So a better approach is if we wanted to darken it, but have it still feel like it's part of that distinct hue family, well, we're going to use both yellow. We're going to add, in this case, we're going to use the cadmium red, and we're going to use a little bit of ultramarine blue. And it's almost going to give it this more golden light quality. I'm just adding a little bit of white to that mixture with the cadmium yellow plus black, and you can see how green it looks by comparison. And so this is why we want to avoid using that in our process.